All right. Looks like we got some folks in here. Once again, my name is Ethan Muntz. I'm going to be your moderator today for the Navigator webinar, the Evolving Ransomware Threat, Stealthy Identity-Driven Exploits. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Robert Wood, who he has built and led security programs across Silicon Valley startups into one of the largest U.S. federal agencies. He also bridged the gap as a leader between technical vision and the people and the culture needed to drive true value out of cybersecurity. We're definitely very excited to have him here on this Navigator webinar from Al Calvio. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Ethan. All right. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm the former, so my name is Robert Wood. I'm formerly, as of about 2 months ago, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which I'm guessing, given the context of everyone working in and around healthcare here at this ISAC meeting, everyone is familiar with, is one of the operating divisions, one of the larger operating divisions under HHS. And so as part of that, I had the pleasure or responsibility of overseeing a number of things at the agency. Most notably, it was our internal enterprise cybersecurity practices, data privacy, incident management, national security, supply chain oriented things. And of course, there's in our context, there is a big emphasis on internal enterprise security, but also security at the program levels. Think healthcare.gov or hospital claims coordination, and then security happening at the contracting entities that were supporting the agency. And then I also had the pleasure of working with CISA and the broader HHS community, establishing and setting the CPGs that were released last year. And so that was myself and Eric Decker. We were co-leads on creating that, and I'm very excited about those being out and the direction that those are hopefully going to help take the healthcare sector. Now, this kind of slide is probably not going to be news to anybody. Some of you may have lived, breathed, had to respond to some chunk of these incidents. And one of the most stark things to me about this evolving timeline of ransomware attacks happening across the sector is that I think in most interestingly in healthcare, when everyone learns about cybersecurity or is kind of brought up in the field, we talk so heavily about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. But when you kind of get out into the world, confidentiality and integrity reign supreme in many cases. When you talk about a data breach, people are oftentimes talking about data loss, data tampering, things of that nature, unauthorized access, data leaks. Ransomware really shines a light on the availability element of that. And of course, now that there is concerns of data loss or data leakage going alongside of a ransomware attack or some sort of service outage, you have this 1-2 punch in the CIA triad. And unlike many other sectors, take a non-critical organization like a gaming company or a manufacturing organization. Like, yes, they have important roles relative to their customer base or their stakeholders. Healthcare has a very unique role that it plays in the nation, in that it is directly tied to patient safety, patient life outcomes. And so an availability incident in this sector can be extremely damaging. And so, I think that is known to all of us, and it is something that can, of course, be leveraged against us in the sense that these types of attacks are much more appealing to an adversary group looking to exploit, target, take advantage of, or get something out of the healthcare sector. Now, when I was at CMS and even prior, dealing with healthcare or dealing with ransomware and malware defensiveness at the organizations I was at, I did 3 startups prior to joining CMS. You sort of set up your traditional defenses against malware, against social engineering, phishing attacks, credential loss, things like that. And ransomware started off when it first really came on the scene as a noteworthy attack pattern that claimed its own name and all of that. It was very much functioning like your traditional malware model. Something, some sort of exploit, binary, lands on a device, lands on a server somewhere, and then there is relatively automated propagation, or either propagation to other devices in some sort of worm-like distribution capacity, or execution, like automated execution on the target device that was initially exploited. Now, we're really starting to see this evolution across, and this is not just exclusive to ransomware, but this evolution of the business model that criminal organizations and threat organizations are taking advantage of, and then on top of that, this adaptation of ransomware groups really being adaptive in their targeting and having a human in the loop, having a human do explicit reasoning and targeting of certain parts of the defenses of an organization really kind of ups the ante. Because where we started as an industry was, we rolled out our antivirus, we rolled out our patches, we rolled out our multi-factor authentications and things like that. And maybe it wasn't perfect. We tried to get as close to 100% coverage as we could, but that's where we started. And then we started to bring in threat intelligence, which gave us insights into the way that certain threat groups were operating. But the way that these latter two evolutions have really started to break that down is we can't really reason about a particular threat group in the same way anymore, because we have this modularization dynamic happening with respect to the explicit functions of an attack. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, or kind of decompose it a little bit more as we go. So this term ransomware as a service has started to emerge. Of course, we have everything as a service. You have hotels and cars as a service, software as a service, platform as a service, everything as a service. It's a fun labeling of a thing, but it really talks about an interaction model of one entity providing something in this like black box transactional way to other entities that need that output. And so you have this, you have ransomware really breaking down into several key parts. You have your access broker, which is getting that initial foothold. This is where, if you're doing some kind of red team or penetration test as an organization, this is probably the kind of thing that those assessors are looking at. They're looking for holes, they're looking for bugs, they're looking for people giving up their credentials. And so, there are those that specialize in providing access based on some set of criteria to those that need it, these operator or affiliate groups. And so, exploits come in a number of different ways. I started my career off doing red teaming with a firm called Cigital, and this was a big thing that we ended up doing on a day in, day out basis, whether it's web applications, networks, people, etc. And so, thinking about this is very much a traditional, like you want to have good, strong defenses over the thing. You want to know about your environment, know about your attack surface, and protect that attack surface as much as you can. Once you start to get into, if you kind of assume that at some point somebody's going to get into something, somebody's going to gain some sort of foothold. It's inevitable, whether it is a technical issue or a personnel related issue in the form of phishing or social engineering. That's where you start to get into this ransomware as a service or service affiliate part of the equation. And thinking about lateral movement, thinking about the leverage that an adversary can get over, Kerberos tokens or internal like JWTs related to single sign-ons and stuff like that. Like this is where that propagation or that proliferation of access can turn into a much bigger issue, whether it's propagation of a exploit binary or malicious binary, or propagation of access that then eventually leads to some sort of exploit drop and the eventual ransom, that dreaded ransom encrypted message or notification or something that comes up that notifies your team of the issue. And so the thing to really take away from this slide is, we had this modularization of the business model or the engagement model for adversaries, and you could think about it in these different dimensions. Those that are specialized in selling access to a particular type of organization or one that matches a certain criteria. Those that specialize in the lateral, navigating the lateral movement and the propagation of access, like basically expanding or broadening access, or customizing a particular ransomware binary to get around the internal security controls and EDR, microsegmentation tooling, things of that nature. And then those that are actually operating it, and this would be like the end target APT that you're probably thinking about. The ones that you're going to be negotiating with or communicating with should the ransom actually end up taking effect. Now, one of the things to really note here is unless that access broker gets an absolutely stellar point of access and they're able to get into exactly what they need to do their thing to the full extent and damage and impact that they are really intending, it's almost a near certainty that you're going to have some amount of reliance on their side on privileged accounts. Now, privileged accounts are effectively what's allowing this lateral movement and propagation of ransomware, and that can come in a lot of different forms, whether it's a Kerberos token, JWT, an actual like highly privileged account, if you don't have some sort of like privileged access management or rotating secrets, things like that. Like I used to work a lot in and around the software security, application security scene, and highly scoped IAM roles, secrets that were hard coded, things of that nature that could be compromised in some way and then abused to do a lot of different gnarly things inside of an organization. That's where those are huge assets that allow and enable these groups to function more effectively and with more impact. And one of the things to note here is that because all of these, like unless you're legit just abusing a credential, like the golden ticket attacks or things like that, which are I don't think our tooling does a great job of defending against and detecting and responding to those things across the board. However, if you're thinking about a legitimate privileged account that is stolen, and this is one of the reasons why like social engineering, for example, is so effective, is they're legitimate accounts, and so they will oftentimes evade your traditional security solutions that are looking at the activity, and they're taking cues and keys off of the assets or the data points that exist inside of the environment at which they are monitoring. It might be a laptop or a user account or an email address or a secret or a service account or something of that nature. And unless it does something wildly anomalous, and you're actually looking for anomalous kind of outside baseline activity, which is oftentimes not the case with the way that these monitoring solutions come out of the box. So unless you've done the custom work to tune those things and set up those kind of alerts, then this kind of leverage over a privileged account is likely going to end up leading to some kind of bypass around the traditional security solutions. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this, but one of the things that I want to drive home with this Black Cat ransomware that was associated with the Change Healthcare United Healthcare attack earlier this year is the fact that it was, at least based on our understanding, it was a derivative of something that we knew about already. And just like you can with any other piece of software, you like being able to rewrite, repackage, sign, do all of those things that you're doing to build legitimate software, but you're doing with known malicious software, helps get around traditional security controls such as EDR, antivirus, and or your other types of monitoring. And if you have what looks like legitimate signed software emitting certain types of security activity and such, monitoring tools and or SOC analysts may not be keying off of that as something that's malicious and need to be something that needs to be dug into. So yeah, we don't have to dig into that bit. So there's a little bit of an expanded view of that Black Hat offensive lifecycle. And so you're going to look at all the stuff over here as your initial bit of access and the discovery that goes along with it. And none of these things are jaw droppers, game changers, revolutionary types of exploits. And that's not to shame anybody that was involved in this attack, because security is not, it's not for the faint of heart. It's not easy. And especially the larger organizations get, the harder, in my opinion, it is to apply consistent security controls across the environment. And you end up with this huge emphasis on network segmentation and monitoring cross boundaries and that lockdown of potential privileged account or privileged access abuse, because in the large enterprise settings, you have the potential for assets or attack surface that might not be part of any formal inventory or like situational awareness context that a team member has, but it's there. It might be through an acquisition that was made, might be through some kind of shadow IT, might be through something that was just old and then kind of decommissioned, but not truly decommissioned. There's a whole lot of ways that this can happen. Even APIs that are new and in maintenance, in proper use right now, but don't have complete documentation. Like it's not uncommon for the Swagger docs for an API, for example, to have undocumented attack surface associated with them. And so like this whole spectrum of shadow attack surface that can exist in larger organization and smaller, but I think it's more prevalent in the larger your organization gets, it's inevitably it's gonna accumulate red tape, and it's gonna accumulate this kind of stuff. And there's a maxim, anyone who's spent time with me on any level has probably heard me talk about this, called Conway's Law. That is, it's effectively a way of describing the output of any system or product or process as something that's going to mirror the org structure that created it. So if you end up having a really complicated, sprawling organizational structure, communication structure, then you're going to have really complicated, disjointed process and systems and stuff that come out of it. And so it puts a lot of pressure on this middle part of the security equation to detect and be able to detect legitimate resource abuse and detect potential like malware entry and movement inside of an environment. And so like that middle part of the security domain activity spectrum is getting a lot of emphasis here. And then of course on the exfiltration and impact side of this, like monitoring and controlling and restricting domain or data exfiltration at the other side or on the right of boom end of the attack spectrum is also something that's really challenging in large environments. Like you might have robust monitoring in place, but you've also got more people doing more things on their networks, accessing more resources on the internet, and there's a lot of crafty ways for an adversary to exfiltrate data. I mean, even attack kits like Cobalt Strike, for example, you can set up payloads and listeners and do C2 over DNS. like who's restricting DNS out of their environment. So it puts a ton of pressure on this middle part again. And this was one of the areas where at CMS we were actively exploring the deception, the spectrum of deception technologies and deception approaches, using like just very simple manually created things, as well as exploring the full-on platform, which is how one of the points of connection I have with our Navigator sponsor here today, Calvio, is like doing very simple things in systems like like a honeypot type file or honeytokens and things of that nature. Basically, they attempt to take advantage of a privilege abuse happening inside of an environment where a legitimate resource might access something because they don't have the knowledge of what's actually happening in the environment, but they have the access to do so, accessing something that they should not or would not ever normally access. Could be a network share, could be a file, could be use of a credential, things of that nature. And when that happens, you have this really high fidelity alert that your team can subsequently follow up on and respond to. So I've talked a little bit about like the ways in which these ransomware attacks, this emergent body of attacks, is bypassing your traditional security solutions. And part of that is in part due to let me go forward a little bit, is in part due to this decomposition of the business model, where you have in this evolution of attack group behaviors, where you have more active decisioning, active targeting, and decision making happening at the point of gaining initial access or the point of lateral movement. And we're really good at detecting and responding to and controlling deterministic types of attacks. That's, a piece of malware does this thing when it's run in this environment. However, one of the reasons that, we oftentimes talk about how hard it is to defend against a committed attacker. One of the reasons that is, and usually that's tagged as some kind of APT. Doesn't necessarily have to be some kind of nation state backed actor, but somebody who is committed, is because when they're committed, they're thinking critically about the things that they are seeing, and the patterns and the controls and the context in which they are operating in. And so they have this really fast OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. And when they encounter a piece of technology, a certain configuration of said technology, or anything of the like, when they're probing your environment, they're able to adapt their approach to what they're seeing. And so that's the danger, is that the impact of these things is getting so large, and we have this decomposition. So you can have this specialist approach, really investing in getting access to things, and then just selling off that access to those that are going to specialize in other parts of the life cycle. And so as an enterprise, of course, you have to think about the whole spectrum of risk and risk management and threat. However, from their standpoint, they can just specialize. Like if you were running your enterprise and all you had to do was run a really, really tight forensics or malware analysis function, things would probably be a lot easier. But if that's all that you're good at and that's all you spend your time doing, then a lot of other parts of your security program are going to falter. Vulnerability management, identity and access management, and security configuration and drift and monitoring and all of that other stuff, business continuity, plan execution, and all that other stuff is going to suffer. So we don't have the luxury of being able to specialize as the adversaries do in this decomposition model. And so I'm going to skip past this last part. So where I'm going with all of this, and I'm going to kind of continue to build on and reference this experience that I had at CMS, because we had this whole sprawl of attack surface. We had our enterprise, we had the programs, then we had the contractors, and then we had subcontractors. And there were multiple security incidents that I had that my team and I ended up overseeing, where you had ransomware attacks happen at the point of a subcontractor or prime contractor that ended up impacting data that we were using, and then it sort of all flowed uphill into us and into our broader security program and triggering our incident management process. And so really, we can't just, it's hard to identify things holistically. And it's imperfect to just rely on a protection, because if we're putting all of our eggs in this protection basket and our identification of assets is imperfect, then just doing simple math, this is going to be imperfect. Now, if you take this dynamic and think about the specialization dynamic that's occurring with these adversary groups, and you assume that at some point somebody's going to get in, somebody's going to get a foothold, somebody's going to have some measure of access that they can then turn over to somebody else, then this is where you have to start really investing. And you can invest with your traditional security tools and establish baselines and all of that. But if you start to think about, and this is where that deception-like technology, or that deception-like approach comes into play, is if you can take advantage of the detection relative to privileged access abuse, then you can complement traditional security monitoring, detection and response approaches, and that really high fidelity alerting process. And you'd want those things, like you'd want your SOC and your incident management team to be responsible for facilitating and following up on those things. This is just one more tool in their toolkit. But understanding that this is the direction that, based on what we know right now, these groups and these operating models are leading to, complementing your traditional security, whether it's Splunk or Elastic, or you're taking a security data lake approach with like a Panther or something. Regardless of what you're doing with respect to detection and response, giving yourself more insight into these potential privileged account abuses is going to be a beneficial thing for your defense in depth strategy here. Now, I want to spend just a minute talking about these, I guess, like kind of driving home this identity-based defense strategy. So there's a whole spectrum of solutions out there that is emerging. You can spend time on Gartner or Google or Forrester or whatever, wherever you get your sources of new solutioning and such out there, that is all focused on this identity as the new perimeter dynamic. And one of the things that is really that I found really interesting about this is we have identities that are kind of resident in a specific application. You have a username and password associated with a service that you use. We have identity directories that are moving into the cloud. That might be Azure ADFS, that might be Google, that might be Okta, what have you. That's my wife texting me. And so you have these identity directories that are in the cloud. Then you've got HR tools that are tied into these directories that facilitate access into these directory services, and subsequently the applications that they then broker access to from a identity provider and service provider relationship standpoint. And then you've got, even beyond that, you've got this whole host of services that are accessed and authorized into through like OAuth grants. And that in and of itself is not something that any of your traditional like identity management solutions is really equipped to help you with, unless you're willing to just like bring down the hammer on like OAuth grants and things like that from let's say you're running Google Workspace as an organization or Office 365 as an organization. You're saying like, thou shall not across the board grant access to anything in this Microsoft or Google boundary to this other application, which is that might be one of those like hills you have to die on sort of things as a security team, because you're going to be directly putting yourself in between the business and its enablement and what it wants to do and trying to do something sensible to protect it. And so that's always a tension that CISOs and anybody working in a security organization has to balance and has to consider. We don't really have the luxury of going nuclear on every single defensive measure that we may want to put in place. Otherwise, we may not be in a job very long, or we might not be loved. And people that might end up leading to people just telling us what we want to hear and then going around us and creating a shadow IT type of environment. I've seen these things play out in consulting engagements and through friends who are in these roles, and it can be really damaging to try to also come back from that. And so, also really trying to invest in this identity protection, like thinking about the cyber defense matrix here. Like we put a lot of emphasis into like protection. And then detection and response in some cases. And oftentimes we're all focused up here. Like, we worry about stuff when it's here in the data world. Our products are very heavily focused on networks and applications and devices. But all of this stuff centered around users is oftentimes, we log people in, we give them MFA, and then that's just kind of done. We don't really think about it beyond that in many cases. And what I want to encourage you is to like really try to embrace this notion. It's a little gimmicky, but this whole identity is the new perimeter dynamic, and lean into solutions, whether it's a commercial solution or just general like configuration and work that you can do to better protect the identity of your machines, of your users, and all of that both externally and internally. Because that internal, once you get access to something, if you invest in this area, you're going to make that propagation, that lateral movement harder. And if you're making that harder, this is all about like adding pressure points and adding friction at the right places, hopefully giving yourself an opportunity to detect something and then subsequently respond to it. So with that, that actually brings me to the end of this presentation. I didn't want to make this super duper long. And so we have a little bit of time set aside for questions if anyone has them. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone for the time this afternoon / this morning. Again, depending where you are, is my pleasure to jump in with the HISAC team. They do a ton of amazing work for the sector, and very much appreciated them while I was on the other side in the federal government, and still do on this side as well. So thank you to Ethan and the team.
Thank you, Rob. Looks like we got a Q&A here in the queue. Let's see. Oh yeah, okay, awesome. There it is. Are there any recommendations regarding the security strategy for creating honey tokens?
So as far as honey tokens go, so I think you need to first evaluate whether you have like how honey tokens are going to work in your environment. We tend to throw these terms around and just to kind of assume that they are blanket applicable to any environment. Like a honey token might be an IAM key pair, in AWS. It may be a secret for an application or an API key or something of that sort. And so you have to first kind of think about your threat model and your organizational context, and what a token is and where it might be applicable and what it might be associated with to think about it being attractive. And if you're going to do very lightweight types of deception technologies or deception approaches, sorry, let me put this thing on airplane mode because I'm getting blown up. Then if you're going to do very lightweight touches of or sprinkles of deception, then in that case, there is, you may very well be able to just create the tokens manually, associate them with some kind of alert. Like let's say if you have, let's say it's an IAM key pair, and that key pair gets used. You're collecting security logs from AWS, and you can create a specific alert as a critical alert, goes right to the front of the queue, or fires off some sort of alarm bell that is out, a little more extravagant than your bread and butter alert, if that thing is used. And so in that case, like you could do it on a very small scale. If you're thinking about creating honey tokens and managing them at broader scale, I think like starting to explore some of these platform approaches. And this is where we found ourselves, is like we could do this on small scales with specific high profile systems. But if we wanted to do this more systematically across the board and try to do things at the device stage and application stage and all of that, then it was going to get really hard to manage. And ultimately, if you have one part of your security program that's really hard to manage or time consuming or complicated, and then it's very unlikely it's going to be maintained and actioned and sort of tended to. And in this field, you end up reaping what you sow. And so really like thinking about what it means to you is kind of where I would start with that. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Looks like we got another one. When going into a threat hunt, do you have any main tactics that you look for?
I don't know if I would say any main tactics. I think this is also one of those things that is hugely variable. So the way that we would direct our threat hunt teams at CMS was going to be very scenario specific. So, I'm thinking about the types of things that we're worried about. Maybe it's stuff happening in the news or stuff that we hear about from other agencies or our kind of fusion centers, and the intel sharing that we did at the federal level. We would end up crafting scenarios and then feeding those to our hunt team that were associated with that. And that's just kind of how we ran things. And the way that, I guess, the reason that we ended up doing that as opposed to taking a more like playbook oriented approach is if we felt like we could put something into a playbook, then we could just make that a standard like bread and butter type dashboard or alert or things like that. And then we're effectively trying to take insights or things out of our threat hunt team and then move those over to the more repeatable, scalable SOC function in our security organization. And if that worked, really well and it was repeatable and declarative to some level, then it would kind of stay there in the SOC. And the threat hunt team was doing the more unique scenario-driven analysis. Hope that helps.
Awesome. Looks like we got another one here. How can security around identity assist with IoT, if at all, given the limited controls that can be applied to medical devices due to vendor requirements / denial of permissions?
Yeah, the IoT thing that's tough. That's really tough. I mean, machine identities and stuff in general tend to be, a trickier body of work to deal with and work through. But when you think about IoT, especially in the healthcare scene, where you have a huge spectrum of maybe legacy IoT devices, all the way up to your kind of smart cameras and things like that, and your facility security, there is a lot of variance in terms of device capability and memory footprint and configurability and things of that nature. I think in this case, like for example, our at Sidekick, where I'm leading a team now, we're working with an energy company, so I'm going to kind of drift outside of the healthcare sector. We're working with an energy company at the moment, and one of the things that is in their environment, they have all these like oil valves and stuff controlling pipelines in the area of the country that they serve. And like these things they're very simple devices. They're network connected, all of that. They fall into that IoT category, but they can't really do anything with them. And so They can't really monitor them or anything of that nature. Or even like we can't really test them unless we put separate testable things on a like a test bench. And so to assist with that problem, like, thinking back to that cyber defense matrix spectrum of security activities, actually I can go back and kind of talk through this. So, in that case, we're looking at more, they know about all of them. They have a way of identifying them, which is great. We have a way of protecting them in the sense of we're going to at least like segment them from a network standpoint. And so like we had them introduce a bastion host to be able to get into that network segment and be able to communicate with those things or basically control them in some way, shape, or form above and beyond what they were doing in a standard capacity. And so like that was one thing. And then from we couldn't do much from a detect standpoint. And so what we did have is we also helped in the creation of an IoT or device kind of classified or directed incident response plan and continuity plan. So oftentimes, an organization, you talk about your IRP or your BCP, and they're just generic documents. You do your annual tabletops, et cetera. And that's maybe helpful when what hits the fan, or it might not be. But having a sense and doing tabletops and things of that nature specific to something that's really relevant to your organization or mission critical to your organization, as this is in this case. So in like a healthcare setting, that might be the types of IoT devices that are directly tied to patient experience and patient engagement, and knowing what you're going to do if and when those things are impacted some way, shape, or form, whether it's fallback plan, recovery, and or incident response, I think is a really impactful thing. So like you can control them somewhat, even though you can't control the device itself very effectively. You can control them somewhat through the network and the kind of users that are allowed in the network and things of that nature. You can even put monitoring in place on that bastion or anything that might cross the threshold, and then you can kind of work over here on the more process-oriented side of the security equation. So, in my mind, like this is where really understanding what your environment looks like, kind of breaking it down and not just applying your kind of your bread and butter, here's the old faithful security playbook to every situation that you have. Like you want to be able to get contextual in the way you're thinking about your defenses and your preparedness. All right.
Thank you. Looks like we got, let's see, any recommendations around response actions when a honey token alert is triggered?
Sorry. I feel like I'm back in the government talking so much. It depends on what the token is, right? Or where it's deployed, what it's associated with. And this is where, if you're going to deploy these things, you want to make sure you have clear SOPs defined for like who's going to investigate, like who's going to get the alert, who's going to investigate. And if you're going to deploy it, let's say again, it's that AWS IAM token. And, in that case, you might be engaging a member of the engineering team or IT team who's involved with the AWS accounts and the AWS environment. And so, it might lead to kind of silent behind the scenes investigation to determine like what accessed that token. Was it a particular user account? Can you snapshot memory remotely and things of that? You want to have very defined SOPs for each of these things that you deploy, or like each new kind of deception technique that you deploy. So that way you can really quickly start to action those things. And it's going to be different every single time. So, if it's let's say it's a server that happened to use a key, like you're probably going to respond to a server doing that differently than you would a developer laptop. Like, why would a developer laptop be using this key that they don't normally have? and what's going on with that developer laptop. Has anything new been installed on it? Has, what's the activity been like on the, their browser, their email, etc. And so it just, but having an SOP geared around and roles and responsibilities geared around the deployment of a deception technique, and then being able to kind of map that or draw lines to the other parts of your security operations function. That might be playbooks. They might be like automated SOAR playbooks, or they might just be things like more manual written playbooks that an analyst is gonna end up going through is important.
Thank you. Here we go. Where should we place these honey tokens? We have a large environment with multiple AD domains and many endpoints.
So I think, yeah, it could get, so you have to kind of weigh the risk reward of, because part of deception is you're doing something that's not obvious to catch somebody who has limited to no insider knowledge of your environment. And so, on one level, you want your deception tactics deployed as widely as possible. So maybe deploying them somewhere on the endpoint as a file, or something along those lines that that might get triggered or accessed. But on another level, thinking about how an adversary might, like, if there's something that exists on every machine, that may just look a little suspicious. Like, there's a lot of research out there around like identifying honeypots, like your bread and butter honeypots that are out there on the internet or even within environments. And you do that through like the way that they consistently respond, or the types of services they have open, and or the combination of services they have open, and things of that nature. And so if it's obvious, then it's not going to be effective. And so you may consider, like, if you're going to do a device specific deployment, having it deployed on a kind of a random sampling of devices, could be helpful. Or putting something on some kind of network share, or some like shared resource that devices are going to end up having access to naturally, but that they wouldn't go to unless they were looking for it. That may be a way to, because oftentimes like these bigger environments are going to have shared access pools somewhere. It's like the global drive that everyone can pull down company policies from, that kind of thing. And I mean, I remember doing pen tests, and like you'd go through those things, and you'd look for things that might contain employee information or passwords, or something to that effect. And then you'd pull that back into your internal discovery loops and activity, and see if you can get anywhere else with it. And so you just kind of you have to kind of think through the whole process. And I think if you're going to apply deception effectively, in my opinion, you've got to be thinking at the same time through your threat model, which involves thinking about your environment, and thinking about your data flows, and thinking about your user interactions, and how things are segmented. And you can always try things out, like try it out before you go into a pen test or something. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, do a little bit of retrospective and ask yourself, like, maybe why didn't it work? Maybe the pen testers just didn't get to it, or they didn't see it, or they did see it and they didn't want to use it, or something to that effect. And so, there's a lot of ways that you could or should be, thinking about it on that, about that. But I think like anchoring it in the threat model is a good way to go.
All right. In healthcare, insider threat is one of our primary concerns. Can honey tokens, or just deception in general, be useful in detecting insider threats?
Yeah, I think so. Now again, so like we had an insider threat function that reported up to me at CMS, and they functioned outside of, they worked closely with, but they functioned outside of the SOC. And they did that so that way we could control information really tightly. And I think if an insider threat team, like this is where you might have very, very selective use of security controls or deception controls. Now, thinking about there's a fantastic talk that I'll reference here. A gentleman named Nathaniel Gleicher gave it a few years ago, and if you search like what can cybersecurity learn from the Secret Service, you'll find it. I think he gave it a Usenex conference or something to that effect. And the whole idea, the core premise of the talk was like the way that the Secret Service treated people they were protecting as high value assets, and they would map out flows to the high value asset, and so take an insider threat, stealing some very sensitive information or tampering with some very sensitive information. Like you have your kind of bread and butter, just like insider abuse, and then you have the really really damaging like oh shoot kind of moments. And so, I'm talking about the latter here. And so in that case, controlling and identifying and enumerating the access or the routes to those really key high value assets, and then placing security controls in like concentric circles, moving out away from the high value asset was the core premise of the talk. And so, the closer that something is in those concentric rings to the asset, the more urgency you should the more urgency you should assign to it from a criticality standpoint. If something's kind of on the edge, maybe it's just a bread and butter alert because they're far away from the asset. Nothing's really happening yet. But if something happens, and like this might be network routes to get to a particular asset. It might be accounts that have to be used to access an asset. Like in the energy scenario I was referring to earlier, you had these bastions that were in place before you could get into the IoT network segment. And in that case, if there were particular like a shared account or something of that nature that was in place as a honey account on that bastion to get into the thing, or any kind of malicious activity or whatnot that they identified there, that triggers a way bigger alert than something that's happening on another server outside of that environment. Like, yes, you might be able to get from another device to the bastion eventually, but it's not happening on the bastion yet. And so, you can kind of assign P levels to the alerts based on their proximity to the asset. So, I mean, I think yes. I'll also go back to the threat modeling answer in the sense that if you understand what your threat model is as an insider threat team, you're thinking about the kind of things that an adversary might want or might want to do, or the kind of things that would be really damaging to you as an organization. Like you can respond accordingly with whether it's a honey token or some other sort of honey thing, deception tactic, we'll call it. I mean, there was an organization I worked at in the past where we were really concerned about phishing, and we created a fake identity, just a fake person, fake email address, made some blog posts for them on our company website, gave them a fake LinkedIn profile, etc. And then we tied monitoring, like our security monitoring, our SOAR playbooks to that person's inbox, and anything that they were getting that didn't come from just like a known marketing source, but anything that they were getting, we would instantly feed it into a SOC queue. And that might be an extreme example, but it's just an example of us trying to leverage. It could have been a horrible idea, but us trying to leverage some measure of creativity relative to the things that we're concerned about in our environment to deal with the threat.
Sorry, I was looking for the mute button. Thank you. Thank you. Looks like we
You're
got
welcome.
one last question in the queue here.
Okay.
This member is interested on detecting attacks targeting medical devices for their healthcare organization. There's a lack of EDR tooling on these devices. Can deception technology help with that?
Yeah, I think potentially. And it would depend on the device involved. Some device like there are some medical devices or IoT devices out there with like horribly low memory footprints that you can't really do anything to. They're just, very small, restrictive, embedded devices, and you just that's what it is. You just get that. And so in those cases, you have to kind of think about those other, what are the things you can kind of do around that thing to protect it. And so, putting in place those sort of deception tactics around the core thing, I think can be a really helpful approach. Or if there is the means by which you can modify or do anything to the medical device from a configuration standpoint or whatnot, you may have the option to put in place some kind of deception tactic. I'm going to refrain from calling it just like a honey token, because I think it goes well beyond that as far as like leveraging deception as a detect and respond capability as a security team. But if you have some measure of configurability, then I think you may have the option, whether it's through like an account or a credential or a file path or something of that nature, that if it's triggered and if you have logs to kind of key off of it or something, then you may be able to do something.
All right, thank you. Let me go take one last look in the queue here. Doesn't look like we're getting too many more. Well, thanks again to Calvio and Rob. Thanks for coming out. Health ISEC, we definitely appreciate you guys doing this, providing us and our members with a lot of awesome knowledge that we wouldn't know otherwise. I know I had a lot of fun today during this presentation. Deceptions is always kind of something I found pretty interesting, and I hope you got the same out of it that I did.
Thanks for having me, Ethan.
My pleasure. All righty. Have a good rest of your day, guys.
Well.